Hello everyone, this is Build from 2 Productions, and today I'm going to be showing you how to stream from one OBS to another over the internet using SRT without any servers. Now before I start things off, I will say that some of this will be slightly advanced, not as advanced as setting up an Ubuntu server, but if this tutorial seems a little long, it's because I plan to go in depth. I want you to understand exactly how this works and how you can set it up yourself. So let's just take it from the top. So the first thing we're going to have to do is forward a port or multiple ports if you want to do multiple streams. Now, before we port forward, I think it's important that you understand what public and private IP addresses are. All of the devices on your local private network are given a specialized IP address to identify them. And then all of those are connected to your router, which connects to the broader internet through a single public IP address. This public IP address is how people will connect to you, and it's the same IP address you see if you Google what is my IP address. As an example, let's forward port 4760 from our router to our private IP address. Assuming we did everything correctly, when data comes in on that port, the router should forward it to our computer. In that case, connection successful, everything is working great, right? Well, it's not quite so simple. For example, let's say you and another computer disconnect from the network. When you reconnect to the network, sometimes you get assigned a different private IP address. As you can see now, your router is actually forwarding the data to the wrong computer. And we're gonna either need to change our port forwarding settings or make sure that that IP address is always reserved. And to make an IP address always reserved for your computer, that is called setting a static IP address. So let's go through how to set that up. You should be able to Google how to set a static IP address for your specific router, but just for this tutorial, I will show you how it looks on mine. The first step is to open up Command Prompt by typing CMD into Windows Search. Once you have the command prompt open, just type ipconfig and then enter. Now I have a bunch of virtual adapters from when I have VPNs or virtual machines, but what you want to find is your main connection. Now, depending on if you're using Wi-Fi or Ethernet, it should say, so in my case, that would be Ethernet adapter 2, and none of the other network adapters have all of the fields filled out. Only this one has all 5 filled out. What you're looking for is your default gateway. What you want to do is take that default gateway and enter it into your web browser. And here I'm brought to my Verizon router sign in, and I'll just enter the password that I set up earlier. Usually your router will be set to a default password, so you can either look on your router to find what the login information is. It is not your Wi-Fi password. That is something else. You want to look for your admin login. You should see something that says admin login on a sticker on your router, and if you don't, it is probably using the defaults. And you can find the defaults by looking up your router name and then just default login. Let's say you have a Linksys router. Usually you'd put in the model here, but let's just say Linksys router default login. So in this case, if you had a Linksys router, you would just put admin in the password field if there wasn't a sticker on the router that had something specific. In my case, to set a static local IP address, I need to go to Advanced and then IPv4 address distribution and then connection list to show all of my active connections, and then I just need to find whichever device I want to set static. In this case, that would be build PC, my main PC, so I would just go to edit, and then I can set my private IP address to be whatever I want. As you can see, I assigned mine to 192.168.1.200. You don't want to change these first 3 numbers, generally speaking. For the last number, I just recommend something high, probably over 100, and I make sure I have static lease type checked. I can change the name of it if it's wrong for some reason. Static leases aren't the easiest to find on every router. You might need to look into this a bit more, but there is another option that will work if your router does not have this functionality or if you can't find it. But if you manage to set a static private IP address using your router, you don't need to do this and you can skip to the timecode on screen. Open the start menu and search for network status. And then here on the left side, you can either do Wi-Fi or Ethernet. Either one works. You want to look on the right side here and go to change adapter options. You'll get this little window that pops up that shows all of your network devices. In my case, Ethernet 2 is my device. So if you right click and go to properties, scroll down Internet Protocol version 4, you can double click on that and check this box and enter your IP address manually. Now, if you don't know your default gateway, remember your default gateway and subnet mask are already here. So all you need to do is take your subnet mask and default gateway, mirror them in these boxes, and plug whatever IP address you want into here. Now, this should definitely be a higher number, because if you do a lower number, your router could try and give it to someone and it could just be a mess. So you should definitely have the last number in this series be over 200. And even with this setup, sometimes you can get a conflict. Now, Windows 10 is actually good about this. Windows 10 will pop up and say, hey, we have a network conflict. This needs to be solved. If that ever happens, sadly, you'll have to disable this and turn it back to obtain an IP address automatically. But feel free to type in the IP address you want, preferably something like this that's in the 200 or higher range, so it doesn't conflict with devices on the network that get assigned the lower numbers. Mirror the subnet mask, mirror the default gateway, and then close everything out. And then if you disconnect your device and then connect it again, you should see the new IP address assigned if you go back into command prompt and type ipconfig again. But this may not apply right away. You might need to do release and renew on your network stuff, but don't worry about that. If it doesn't show up, just reboot your computer. That's honestly the best way to do it without getting all technical. But if rebooting doesn't even work, then you can do ipconfig/release and then ipconfig/renew. But a warning, if you do ipconfig/release, nothing will work until you type ipconfig/renew afterwards. Now, some of you may not be able to get this to work even after doing a release and renew and rebooting, and that's just because some routers just really don't like you setting things manually. So now you have a static local IP address. Congratulations. The next thing we need to do is pick a port or ports to forward. Now, the number of ports you'll want to forward will depend on how many feeds you want to take in. So 1 port for 1 feed, 2 ports for 2 feeds, etc. Now, before you port forward, what you'll want to do is to Google port forwarding followed by your router name. So like Linksys, whatever this router is. You just want to Google whatever router/modem you have and find out how to port forward. There's usually nice guides online that'll show you how to do it. Like, here's how to do it on this router, and you can usually find out how to do it on basically every consumer router. My router makes this very easy. All I need to do is go to this dropdown and select my device. Or I can specify the IP address manually if I feel like doing that, but just dropdown's easy. And then under application to forward, I just do custom ports, and then you want to select your protocol. SRT uses the UDP protocol. And as for a port, I would recommend like 37491 as your camera 1, and then maybe 37492 as your camera 2. There'll be a link in the description to a big Wikipedia list of commonly used ports, and you just want to avoid using those so that way you don't get conflicts with people's internet. Now, even if you plan on only using one camera, it's still a good rule of thumb to forward multiple ports for yourself, just in case someone has an issue. Sometimes people's internet just is weird and it doesn't let a port through. Forward multiple just so you have multiple options, and on a day of production you don't want things to randomly go down. Once you have the IP address, the protocol, and the port you want to use, just add it and it should appear in the list. Again, this will look different on every router, but it should be relatively similar to this. Now, so far in this tutorial, we've learned about public and private IP addresses. But something you may not know is that your public IP address can actually change sometimes. Now, your public IP address will probably look something like this. Now, somewhere down the line, you could either have a power outage, or you could decide to reboot your router because your internet's being slow, and you could get assigned a number like this. And then if someone tries to stream to your old IP address, well, you're not going to get the feed. Now, something you can do to always make sure that people stream to your IP address without them needing to do anything is set up what's called a DNS. What a DNS is, it's just a URL like google.com. All google.com is a DNS record that points to an IP address. If I type in ping google.com into command prompt, it'll ping this IP address. My computer looks up google.com. It looks for the DNS record, whatever DNS server I'm using. It'll just look up, hey, what's google.com using? And it'll be, oh, well, this IP address. And then it'll just connect to that IP address, say, hey, I want the web page, and then it'll just give it to you. And you can do the same thing, but you can use a service that runs as a program on your computer that automatically updates your DNS to point to your new IP address whenever it changes. DNS is a free service that will give you a subdomain and let you update it with your current public IP address automatically. So all you need to do is sign up for an account and then download their Windows client, log into it. The program just sits on your computer, occasionally checking if your public IP address changed, and if it did, it will take your domain name, whatever you have it set to be, and set your new IP address to that domain name. And it just works. It's a great way to make sure that all of your remote feeds always go to the right place. You can set up your system and then just forget about it. The last thing we need to do before we get to OBS, I know there's a lot of steps, but we're almost there, is to open up Windows Defender Firewall. And then click on Advanced Settings. And then you just need to go to Inbound Rules. Now, all you need to do is add a new rule. This one is going to be a port and UDP port. Now, you can actually specify all of the ports. Let's say you forwarded 37491 all the way to 37497. Let's say you forwarded 7 ports. You could just have these two separated by a dash, and it will allow the entire range from this port to this port. So let's say I had those 7 ports forwarded. All I would need to do is click next, allow the connection on all the domains, name it SRT UDP ports allow, and then you could also put in the range. That way you just know at a glance what it does. Finish, bam, and then any incoming connections on those ports will be allowed by your computer. All right, so far we've learned about public and private IP addresses. We've set a static private IP address. We port forwarded to that static private IP address, set up a DNS so that way our public IP address always gets connected to, and then allowed the port in our computer's firewall. Now we can finally get to OBS. So all we need to do to set up our OBS to act as the receiver for SRT is to add a media source. Let's call it SRT camera 1. Then what we need to do is uncheck local file, uncheck restart playback when source becomes active, turn the network buffering all the way down to 0. Our input is going to be SRT:// and then whatever our static private IP address is that we set up earlier. And then we need to do : whatever port we want to use. So : 37491. And now the important part is setting this as an SRT listener, so it's listening for incoming connections. It's listening for an OBS to connect to it and start sending it data. So to do that, all we need to do is mode equals listener. Now everything after this question mark is called an argument, and arguments can be strung together with the ampersand symbol. You can find a list of all of the arguments here on this ffmpeg webpage, which I will have linked in the description. In our case, we are going to add one more argument by adding an ampersand and adding latency equals 200,000. So latency in this argument is measured in microseconds, and all you really need to remember for that is you set your latency in milliseconds and then just add 3 zeros. It's as simple as that. Your input format is just MPEGTS or MPEG-TS for short. You should set your reconnect delay probably to the lowest, just 1 second. Use hardware decoding when available should be on, and yeah, you can just leave the rest as is. So now we have our producer OBS just sitting here waiting for a stream. So how about we give it one, eh? We want to send this to our producer over here. The first way I'm going to show you how to do this is the way that has a lot more delay, but it's the easiest way to do it. I don't know why it has so much stream delay. It seems like a bug, and if someone can help me out as to why it's happening, that would be great. But I've tried it so many different ways, and even across the internet, local network, it doesn't matter. It's always higher latency. The first way I'm going to show you is the simple but higher latency way. So we just go to settings, stream, change it to service custom, and then we do SRT://, and then the public IP address of the receiving OBS or the DNS address of the receiving OBS if you set that up earlier. Because I have both OBS instances on the local network, I sort of have to put my private IP address in here. If you were to give this link to one of your observers to stream to you, you would just replace this IP address with that DNS address that we set up earlier. If you remember in this OBS, the URL says mode equals listener, but here I have it say mode equals caller. And the reason for that is because this OBS is calling this OBS, which is listening. And we actually don't even need mode equals caller, because caller is actually the default mode of SRT in OBS. In reality, all we need is $latency equals 200,000. A tip for the latency is that SRT will use whichever side's latency is higher. So whatever the highest common denominator is, it will use that for its latency number. So if I add another 0 here, my latency is now 2 seconds long, and it doesn't care what this says. It'll use the 2-second long buffer. This URL done, I can click apply. As for video settings, just go to output, streaming. If you have a hardware encoder, please use it. That helps a lot. Rate control, CBR, for sure. Bitrate, whatever your internet can handle. Keyframe interval should be 2 or 1. For some reason, on this peer-to-peer OBS, the latency seems to be tied to when it gets a keyframe. So keyframe interval 1 is actually the lowest latency you can get. And okay. And now, if I hit start streaming, see the green bar appears. 6 megabits per second. We get some audio. Bam! OBS to OBS SRT feeds across the internet. Well, it would be across the internet if these two OBS instances were separated. But yeah, as you can see, the latency is about 3 seconds, which is not ideal. That's not really latency good enough to direct people off of. Let's say you're in Discord with your observer and you say like, oh, go watch blue team, go watch this player on this team. It's not really good enough for that. So what we can do is we can use a custom ffmpeg output to get both better quality and better latency. And I'm gonna show you how to do that. So I will stop streaming, I'll go back to settings, output, recording, and you can see this looks pretty standard. If you're on simple mode, make sure to change it to advanced. But yeah, output, recording, change it from type standard to custom output ffmpeg, and you can see I've already pre-filled all this, but change it from output to file to output to URL, and put the same exact link that you used in here, in this box. Set the container format to mpeg-ts, just like in this box. Video bitrate, whatever both your sender and receiver OBS can handle. I found 6 megabits per second to be pretty good. Keyframe interval, 250. That's been a pretty good number for me. And then make sure to check this box that says show all codecs, even if potentially incompatible. Definitely check that. If you don't have a dedicated graphics card to encode, you can just do libx264 for CPU encoding. But if you do have a graphics card, I would recommend NVENC H.264 or NVENC HEVC. If you don't know what HEVC is, it's a different codec entirely to H.264, and it is supported by OBS. It's actually double the quality of regular H.264 streams, so it's actually incredible to use, but I wouldn't recommend it unless you have hardware decoding enabled on your receiving OBS, because otherwise it's really hard on the CPU to decode it. I mean, if you've got a beefy computer, then go for it, but make sure to test this out first to make sure it works for you. But if it works for you, then it is an absolute blessing. You can get beautiful streams across the internet at only 6 megabits per second that I would call totally broadcast ready. Just gorgeous. For audio encoder, just use AAC. Other codecs do work like MP3, but AAC is just the best, and it's just supported by everything. Just use AAC. AAC at 256 kilobits per second sounds pretty good. You're not going to notice any sort of degradation of audio at that kind of bit rate. But yeah, once we have all that set, we just apply our settings, and then we can press the start recording button to stream, which I know it feels super weird. It takes a bit to get used to, but remember, this is a custom ffmpeg output on the recording tab, right? So recording output to URL. We're basically recording to a URL. So streaming, basically. So press start recording, and if you see the pause button appear, that means it connected. Don't worry about like if it doesn't look right away. Once it gets a keyframe, bam, it's just perfect. As you can see here, the latency is like half a second, a little more than that. And this is the kind of latency that you can actually expect across the internet, because whatever this latency value is set to, it will be that exact latency value unless one of your observers has more ping than your latency value, in which case you've got bigger problems. So a general rule of thumb is your latency value should be around 4 times your ping. So if you've got 50 ms, your latency should be around 200 milliseconds, because SRT will actually resend lost packets if it doesn't get them. So that's a nice feature that SRT has. So you can expect real-world latency that looks like this. From OBS to OBS, like from California to Texas, across the entire United States, you can expect this level of latency in your OBS productions, and this level of quality too. Quality is just so good. Gorgeous, beautiful 60 FPS. I mean, assuming your observer actually set their FPS value to be 60, make sure they do, and their output scaled resolution should be 1920 by 1080. But assuming you have everything configured correctly, it will just look beautiful, perfectly smooth. You can direct your observers off a feed this low latency and have just a great production. And if you want to do multiple cameras, you just create another media source, change the port to 2, and then for your sender, just have them send on that same port. And if you want to add a third camera, just add a third media source on the third port that you forwarded, etc., etc., etc. There's technically no limit other than what your internet and your hardware can handle, but the synchronization between 2 streams with SRT is very, very good. Usually it's dead on. I hope you enjoy this for all your productions in the future. That's the end of this tutorial. I hope you learned stuff. I hope this can step up your remote productions to the next level. Thanks for watching. Drop a subscribe to 2NU Productions, and I will see you in the next one.